Hello, hello, everyone. Hope you're all doing well today. Happy March 25th. I know it's Cerebral Palsy Awareness Day, so celebrating all of you CVI families. Welcome, everyone, to CVI Now's live virtual event, all about building accessible and meaningful learning experiences for students with CVI. If you're with us on our CVI Now parent group, drop a hello in the comments and feel free to post questions as they come to you. I am Rachel Bennett, the Content and Community Manager for CVI Now here at Perkins School for the Blind, and I'm a CVI mom. No child with CVI is too anything to keep them from learning. Our children can be readers and writers and problem solvers, and this will look different in each of our kids, but there is no question about our kids' capacity for greatness. We know there's a lot to consider when it comes to designing lessons and activities that are accessible, meaningful, and build skills. How do we blend CVI promising practices with evidence-based learning strategies? How do we think about multimodal expression and receptive communication? How do we collect quality data to measure growth and inform IEP development? I'm thrilled to introduce our expert today. Marguerite Tabato is the Assistant Director of the CVI project here at Perkins School for the Blind. She's a TVI and deafblind specialist. Marguerite has over 20 years of service in the field of visual impairments, multiple disabilities, and deafblindness. As lead teacher of the deafblind program at Perkins, as a classroom teacher, as a specialty early intervention provider. Marguerite has led multiple trainings on CVI through Perkins e-learning webinars and courses and conferences. And Marguerite also recently completed the UMass CVI certification program. Marguerite will present for 90 minutes on this big topic. She will discuss blending CVI promising practices with systematic instruction, thoughtful construction of lessons and activities that are based on comprehensive assessment, and how no child is exempt from learning. After the presentation, Marguerite is here to answer your questions, ones that were already submitted and ones that will come up live. So excited to dive into this important topic. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and give it on over to Marguerite.
Great, thanks so much, Rachel. Let me get my screen set up. Okay. All set? Yep, okay, great. So thank you, everybody. I've been so excited to present to you today, all about building accessible and meaningful learning experiences for students with CVI. I've really made a jam-packed presentation today. There's a ton of information, and I think all of it's very, very relevant. So when I'm going through this presentation, I would just encourage you not to get stuck in these fine details, because all this information is going to be provided through some supplementary documents once the presentation is posted, but to think about the fundamental basics and the themes that I'm discussing throughout, and use that as a foundation for future learning around this very, very, very detailed topic. And another disclaimer I just want to throw out there is that there are many different ways to teach, and there are many different ways that children learn. So the examples provided in this presentation are just that. They are examples and just set a platform to better understand systematic instruction and the impact of CVI on our students. So the overall goal of today's presentation is, when we're thinking about constructing accessible and meaningful experiences for students with CVI, how are we going to take evidence-based instruction and blend that with promising practices? So evidence-based instruction is instruction that is strongly supported by research. And then promising practices are practices that have some research or data showing potential positive outcomes, but are not necessarily generalizable. So why is this important to start with? Well, first off, it's supported by the law. So IDEA and ESEA require that schools use programs, curriculum, and practices that are based on research to the extent practicable. And also under IDEA, instruction is also based on student needs. So getting a little bit more detailed here, for programs with students with CVI, we need to think in terms of CVI accommodations. So those promising practices along with CVI methodologies, and blending that with systematic instruction, which is an evidence-based practice. And we're going to dive into that now. First and foremost, when we're thinking about how we're going to build educational programming, we first need to know how to teach. We have to understand what we're teaching, why we're teaching it, and how we're going to teach it. And that ties very closely with understanding assessment. And specifically with CVI, that is very, very specialized. We need to know what we're assessing, why we're assessing it, and how we're going to assess, and how this collective information feeds into applying promising practices. So identifying those accommodations, the black background, the simplification of materials, the lighting controlled, et cetera, and then putting it all together. And this is by no means linear, because when we apply promising practices and accommodations, that impacts our ongoing assessment, which impacts how we teach. So it's all very, very woven together and connected. And along the way, there has to be collaboration among team members. There is not one particular team member who can do it all. We have to work together to be comprehensive and to provide efficient services throughout the child's entire school day. So I've mentioned systematic instruction, so I just want to briefly go over what I actually mean by that. So systematic instruction is extensively researched instructional methodology from the field of special education. So this presentation in general does come from the field of special ed. And systematic instruction has a focus on mastery of new skills and information through direct instruction that is carefully designed with specific delivery of instruction. So we have to have very careful consideration of the impact of CVI and have lessons that are predictable yet flexible. So it's not about rigidity, it's about really looking at the needs of each student and being flexible to their needs in any given moment and having a plan forward. We're not just putting things in place randomly. There's a reason behind absolutely everything we do. Some examples that you might hear about as far as systematic instruction goes could be reference to instructional trials. So you could think desk work, although it certainly extends beyond that. Naturalistic instruction, so instruction that happens everywhere and anywhere. And task analysis, where we're going to break up tasks into smaller steps to make them achievable or teach them discreetly. Now, there's a lot of benefits when it comes to systematic instruction as far as that predictability. We're putting everything in place for a reason, in that it builds familiarity and predictability for the student, which we know is really important for a lot of our students with CVI, having that predictability, knowing what's to come, and building on that skill set. So familiarity and predictability can actually promote self-confidence and self-esteem. It enhances motivation and attention. And most importantly, it builds positive student and teacher engagements, which is absolutely crucial for making gains in learning. The ultimate goal of systematic instruction is really to maximize the likelihood that whenever a child is asked to learn something new, that they already possess the appropriate prior knowledge and understandings in order to see its value and learn it efficiently. So when we're thinking about putting academic programming in place, we're thinking about building on the child's prior learning. We're thinking about strategically building from simple to complex tasks and areas of understanding. And systematic instruction is designed before activities and lessons are planned. It's really easy to just jump into a lesson, jump into an activity, but we have to know why we're doing it and how we came to be where we are. Otherwise, we don't really have a plan for moving forward. And systematic instruction now looks across all different phases of learning. So just briefly want to touch on this. So there's acquisition, where the child is first learning that brand new skill. There's fluency stages where the child's now getting better at that skill. There's maintenance, the child's ability to be able to do that skill once I've stopped formally teaching them. And generalization, being able to take that skill and complete it across many different conditions and environments. There's a common misconception, and I held this misconception early on as well, that systematic instruction is standardized, and it is far from it. Systematic instruction is all about assessment, individualized assessment, and building on that specific student's needs and being flexible to their needs. So I want, in thinking about a table as an analogy, so we know what it takes to build the table. but it doesn't mean that all tables are built in the same way. So when we think of our students with CVI or children with CVI, there are many different ways to build a table. There are many different ways to get where we need to be. And sometimes we need to be creative in order to get there. Which brings me to, again, this quote by Tammy Reisman, in that you can't make a decision based on the diagnosis. So thinking about those individualized tables, every student has their unique profile and their unique background. So when we're thinking about educational programming and where we're going to go, assessment is absolutely essential. It is the foundation of everything we do. And it's critical to use a whole child approach, because CVI and the implications of CVI always need to be acknowledged and addressed. But we also have to know that that's just one piece of who that child is, and that there's many other factors and areas of consideration that we have to look into. We need to understand the child's individual life experiences, their previous learning, their personal preferences and motivators, which absolutely is a must. Coexisting ocular impairment, hearing, tactile abilities, communication, gross and fine motor cognition, and more. There's so much that makes a child who they are. And so we have to work together to put those puzzle pieces together. Since this presentation is focused around CVI, I'm just going to touch very briefly on CVI assessments, kind of what we're looking for with them, because this is going to feed into the rest of the presentation. So very simply stated, when we're completing a CVI assessment for students on campus and beyond, we complete a number of steps that include a file review, interviews with the parent, team members, multiple observations across natural settings where possible, and then a direct assessment. And the information that we want from these evaluations and these components of the evaluation are to identify the child's current visual attention skills, the child's current visual recognition skills, and then monitoring what does the child do that gives us this information. And this is absolutely critical, because observable behavior is required for skill measurement. Now, I want to be very clear in saying that just because a child isn't demonstrating behavior that signifies understanding or learning, that doesn't mean that learning is not occurring. My point here is that you need observable behavior in order to really confirm skill measurement. So we can look at this in two ways. So we start with looking at visual attention. With visual attention, all I need a student to do is look. I have to present something, and the child needs to look at it. And I can say, okay, this is visual attention, and these are the areas that it's impacted in. But then when you start to think about visual recognition, visual discrimination, or visual identification, that's where we need to start to see more reliable and consistent responses, such as looking when asked to look at a particular item, reaching, pointing, pushing away, smiling, frowning, laughing, crying, moving towards. If they see something that they don't like and they start to turn away and avoid, I know that they recognize it. Using speech or sign language or any additional form of AAC, it's a communicative response that shows me exactly what the child is recognizing and understanding. And so understanding the child's skills in both visual attention and with visual recognition, discrimination, identification is really important. And as we look to building these skills through the inclusion of accommodations and methodologies surrounding visual accessibility, we also have to have focused attention on building consistent and reliable communicative responses, because that's how we're going to really move forward in understanding what the child knows and encouraging them to show us what they know. So in summary, assessment tells us where we are and where we need to go. But answers from assessment are only as good as the questions asked. So what do I mean by that? I want to share a story about a student that we assessed named Jake. So I spoke with Jake's parents before I ever met him. He was an outside eval, so it's not a student that I've worked with regularly. And I got some great information from the family. To summarize, I knew that Jake was 4 years old. His parents shared that he has really strong memory, he's affectionate, he's playful, and that he loves Daniel Tiger and Sesame Street. From his file review, I learned that he had cerebral palsy, diagnosed as being autistic, and he is hard of hearing. And for communication, his parents shared that he had really spontaneous echolalic speech. He would reach and push away to show that he wanted something or didn't want something, and that he would have no response to adult verbal directives. So if I said, Jake, touch the water bottle, Jake wouldn't comply on demand. So I had to be really creative in thinking about how I was going to approach Jake in his assessment to get all the information that I needed. So we did a number of activities with Jake, hands-on activities, really active engagement and playing. And at one point, I wanted to see if I could get any sense of Jake's visual recognition of two-dimensional presentations. So having spoke to his parents ahead of time, I knew that he liked Daniel Tiger and Sesame Street. So what I did was I set Jake up in front of a PowerPoint, and the whole screen would have just a single picture. So in this case, it was just Daniel Tiger. And I was looking for some sort of reaction from Jake to show me that he recognized what he was looking at. So I put Daniel Tiger on the screen, and Jake sat there so intently. He looked at every element of Daniel Tiger, but he didn't smile. He didn't change his facial recognition whatsoever. He didn't laugh, nothing. So I moved on to the next photo. It was a giraffe that looked at Daniel. Same thing, great visual attention, but no change in demeanor. Black and white Daniel, really great visual attention, looked at him, attended. Cluttered photo, really colorful photo. He didn't divert his eyes. He looked at every single element, but still no sign of recognition. Big Bird, same thing. Black and white Big Bird, same thing. Elmo, same thing. And cluttered black and white drawing, same thing. No change. So what I came away from this was, well, I can say that Jake has really strong visual attention. Even to black and white presentations, he had really strong visual attention. So luckily for me, I didn't stop there. I decided that I was going to flip one of these pictures upside down. And as soon as I flipped this image upside down, Jake immediately turned his head sideways to try to view it upside down. Now, this moment has stuck with me now, and I always bring it up because this was an incredibly powerful moment. What information would I have had from that assessment had I not thought to flip that image? I would have said that Jake had really strong visual attention skills, but that I wasn't able to recognize or measure any sort of visual recognition because I didn't see reliable responses. But by flipping that image, I was able to elicit that response and have Jake turn his head to show me something. And then I also wonder what would have happened if I had never asked his parents what he liked. If I had used another TV character that he wasn't interested in, would he have turned his head? I don't know. And this is really important because this is going to drive our recommendations for moving forward. So I think it's really important that we need to know that the answers we get in assessment only come from the activities that we've provided and the path we've really taken to encourage the student to participate. And that assessment doesn't end with these formal, somewhat formal evaluations. Assessment continues the day after the child leaves that assessment space. Now, in understanding, we have to get a really thorough understanding of what the child needs from these assessments, because that's what's going to help drive our IEP process. We're going to put all those results from these collective assessments, vision and otherwise, into the IEP and use those to help drive the development of accommodations, methodologies, modifications at times, current performance, goals, and objectives, which ultimately feed into lesson plans and activities, prompting, and progress monitoring, which continues throughout that course of the year. So it's really important that we know what the child needs to start building that IEP. And the IEP process and everything in between is supported through systematic instruction. So there's many different steps that we would take, starting with one, determining what the students already know, so prior knowledge, and for students with CVI, understanding what their visual needs are, setting a goal for learning, planning instruction supports or how we're going to break down skills and strategies, such as creating IEP objectives or benchmarks. Then we begin to implement lessons and monitor progress, what's working, what's not working. We have a plan for fading support over time so that the student can be more successful. If we're integrating a lot of prompts, how are we going to fade those back? And then continue building on content, monitoring, and providing feedback. So there really isn't a strong start and end point. It's just an endless loop. So with that being said, where do we start? And that's with determining what students already know and identifying prior knowledge. And so I think by doing that, we should first start by thinking about how we learn in general. In order to know what a child has already learned, how do we learn, period? So I find a lot of value in CVI Scotland's website, specifically going through Dutton's CVI lessons. So I'm using this really as a platform for this presentation moving forward. He has a really great flow chart that talks about in order to learn or how to learn something new, you need to have an experience. You need to recall memories from that experience and then recognize new information based on the memory that was coming from previous experiences. And at the same time, when you're having an experience, you can only have an experience if it's perceivable. So if you can see it, you can hear it, touch it, smell it, taste it, it's perceivable. And that makes an experience occur. And when something's perceivable and you can experience it, it becomes meaningful and you're more motivated to engage with it and have further learning. And Dutton says this process of experience, memory, and recognition is how you've learned to do just about everything you can do. So let's go through a little example. So this is a viral meme that was out a while ago. And you can sit here and you can look at this picture. Do you recognize anything? Probably not. I have yet to recognize anything, and apparently most of the internet hasn't as well. So you're able to perceive this, but it's not a complete experience because you're not able to apply any of your recognition and tact skills to it. So it's really not meaningful to you. And it's certainly not going to be motivating over time because you're going to get pretty frustrated about not being able to look and recognize and apply this to past experiences. Now, if I were to show you this object, which is looks like a metal tool, you might not know what this is, but you've had previous experiences, I'm assuming, that will help you figure out what this is. So you might have memories of experiences with scissors. Then you look at this brand new item and say, okay, I see two handles, I see a joint, and I see a clamp. So my experience in using scissors would tell me that this is a tool that opens and closes. So you might not know what this is, but you're able to use your past experiences now to try to move towards learning about something new, about this new item. It's not fully meaningful because you don't know exactly what it is, but it's meaningful in that it's tying to those past experiences again, and you might be more motivated to learn about this. And if you are motivated to learn more about this, this is actually a Victorian dress clip. So if you want to look that up in your free time, by all means, go ahead. So as Dutton talked about the value of experience, of memory recognition, he also discusses the fact that in order to promote learning, that experience needs to be perceived. So therefore, that experience has meaning, and therefore you're going to be motivated to learn, and so on. But to inhibit learning, the experience cannot be perceived. So the experience has no meaning, and therefore you're not motivated to learn. So if a child doesn't have visual accessibility, because they don't have any CVI accommodations or any other accessibility mode through tactile, auditory, they're not getting an experience and they're not going to want to engage like any of us. And when we're thinking about inhibiting learning, we can't not focus on the power of emotion. Positive and happy feelings tied to experiences increase memory and engagement, while negative feelings and stress decrease memory and learning. So if a child is met endlessly with inaccessibility and endless amounts of stress around these learning opportunities that are not accessible, it's going to decrease memory and their learning and their engagement. So we need to rectify that. We need to make sure that we're changing that and making experiences happy and positive and increasing that engagement so that we can maximize learning. So we're going to move now through the rest of this content, thinking about this perceivable, meaningful, and motivating flow. All along the way, we're thinking about how we're going to support that with systematic instruction. So I've done a little bit of a twist here on Dutton's approach, but when I'm thinking perceivable, I'm going to talk a lot about accommodations. So how are we going to make it accessible? How are we going to make it multisensory, accessible through vision, hearing, touch, taste, or smell? How are we going to make it meaningful? And here I'm going to focus a lot on IEP goal and objectives and lesson plan development. How are we going to make it relevant to the student? How are we going to build that foundation and scaffold learning based on prior knowledge and experiences? And how are we going to make learning attainable? And last, but really most important, is motivation and that reinforcement. How are we going to make it fun? How are we going to make it positive, engaging, exciting, so we have those happy experiences that increase that engagement and memory? And while I'm going to present this now in a very linear fashion, perceivable, meaningful, motivating, they very much connect to one another in various orders. So let's start with perceivable. As we've already discussed, accessible learning requires experiences to be clearly perceivable. To learn absolutely anything new, we have to experience it through sight, touch, sound, taste, or smell. Now, I'm a really big supporter of multisensory experiences, multisensory learning, but for the focus of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on vision and give examples around the focus of CVI and vision in particular. So here's a little simulation of perceivable vision. So on the screen, I've got this board of different mathematical equations. And if you've got really good eyesight, you might notice that there's a tiny gray box in the middle of the screen, really small. And if I asked you to learn that, you wouldn't be able to because it's likely not perceivable. So what can we do to fix that? We can make it bigger. So now it's bigger, but it's still not perceivable because now we have really low contrast. So we can make it more perceivable by removing the making high contrast. If we want to enhance it further, let's add color, make that more perceivable. Now let's get rid of all that clutter. Okay, optimal perceivable. You're able to look at this and get a visual piece of information. And we're going to return to this example later because at this point, it's perceivable, but is it meaningful? We'll talk about that in a little bit. We also have to think about, when we're thinking about something being perceivable, so available to that sense and experienced, we also have to be careful not to make assumptions that we are all perceiving things in the same way. So I put two big controversies out there. One, the dress meme that went viral a few years ago with people seeing it black and blue or white and gold. It was all about that conversation that came up about that dress for us to even notice that people weren't perceiving things in the same way. The second greatest controversy comes from my living room. I have lived in my house now for 6 years, and I was speaking with my husband about buying new pillows, and he said he wanted to get blue pillows to match the blue wall. And I said I want to get gray pillows to match the gray wall. So we've lived again in this house for 6 years. And we only knew that we had a difference in perception because we started to talk about it, because we started to have conversations about it. I just assumed that he was perceiving things the same way I was. And in terms of CVI, I think this is a big deal because we know our students with CVI perceive things differently. And it's one of the greatest values of Matt Teachin's 2D image assessment of seeing how children are interpreting different forms and pieces of information. So just again, with perceivable vision, goes back to evaluation, it goes back to assessment. And for vision, it really has to rely both on clinical and functional assessments. So what's done in the eye doctor's office, as well as what's done during, say, an FVA or CVI evaluation. And we have to have consideration for both ocular impairment and CVI. Absolutely critical. There's so many considerations around visual accessibility, all of which can impact visual attention and recognition, ranging from ocular areas of impairment to neurological. And I think there's a lot of misconception too in the field. You know, I've heard, well, it's not about contrast for children with CVI. It's not about size of font for children with CVI, which might be true for some children, but for others, These are absolutely factors. A lot of children with CVI can have reduced contrast sensitivity. A lot of children with CVI can have refractive errors. I can say informally that approximately 96% of our students with CVI on campus have some level of ocular impairment. So we can't just assume, we have to be really critical in thinking about that particular child and what we need as far as accessibility goes. So I have this picture of this plate for an example where we have great use of color, reduced clutter, no complexity. But if you have orange melon on an orange plate, you've got that low contrast. So you have to think about that as well. And having all this information feeds into the accommodations on the IEP. So that's why we need to be very thorough in understanding exactly what the child needs in order to make learning perceivable. So a quick definition, accommodations change how the student learns and how the student completes their work. They do not change what the student learns. So it's not content changing. It's really about what we're going to use in order to give accessibility to that child. So now we're going to dive into creating a visually perceivable lesson. Again, this is assessment driven, so every single student should have their own assessment that drives these recommendations. And when you're thinking about first starting to develop a lesson, you need to identify and specify first who the lesson's going to be with, where the lesson's going to take place, when the lesson should or will occur, what materials are required for the lesson, and how instruction will be delivered. And I'm thinking about Dutton's use of discussing what's perceivable and meaningful and happy and positive. If any of these conditions aren't met, it can make for a more stressful environment. It can make for a negative learning environment experience, which impacts what's perceived and impacts what's meaningful. So we can't overlook this. And all of this information could be detailed in a lesson plan. This is just an example format that I've put together where you just clearly note exactly what you need for that particular lesson as far as considerations for the child's CVI goes, as well as other areas. So here are some examples for some considerations for you're not even starting the lesson yet. You're just thinking about how am I going to set this up and what do I need to really set the stage? So instructor and peers, the who. Who's the instructor and what's their role? Are they familiar? Are they preferred? What's their personality like? We all act differently with different people. If you are learning with someone who's highly familiar and you trust and have a relationship with, you're likely to engage more and do better. If someone's brand new and you're still working on that relationship, it might take some time to warm up, and that can be reflected in the outcomes of any student progress or data. We have to consider instructor attire requirements. So what does the instructor need to wear in that moment? Simplified patterns, no flashy accessories, etc. You want to know, is the lesson one-to-one? Is it a small group or is it a large group? How many additional peers or staff are present? And how will access to people be facilitated? So knowing how many people are in the room or part of that lesson is really important because that impacts the visual clutter, it impacts the noise levels, and it impacts visual accessibility and access to peers and the staff. For a child who has trouble with facial recognition, how are you going to facilitate who's around them and tell them who's around them, or bring all that information that might not be achieved through incidental learning to the child? All has to be very well thought out. We also have to think about the environment. So where is this lesson going to take place? So we think about that in terms of the seating and the location that the seating's in. We think about the student's positioning and their visual field access to peers, materials, and the instructor. We think about clutter, and that could be at near, it could be distance, and also be considerate of clutter on the floor, walls, desk, or ceilings. Depending on the activity the child's engaging with, they might be facing different areas of the room. So we can't just focus on what's in front of them or laterally if the student is going to be in a different position that gives them access to the floor or the ceiling, for example. We have to consider the impact of color. So how are we going to use color highlighting or color coding to our advantage? Is color a distraction? If so, how are we going to modify the walls? Impact of light, what's the best lighting and what lighting's in the room? Is it a support? Is it a distraction for the student? Is it natural, artificial, and where is it? Thinking about impact of motion Are you in a room with a lot of people moving around? Are there fans going on? Are there really reflective windows that could be distracting for the child? Think about the impact of noise. How much chatter is going on around you? Are there open windows that's bringing in traffic noise? Is the AC running? A lot of this we might just tune out in any environment, but a lot of our students don't do that. They focus right in on that, and that can be a really big distractor. And lastly, temperature requirements. Something, again, I think that's often overlooked. Is the room too hot? Is it too cold? Think about feeling uncomfortable yourself and not being ready to learn because you're too focused on your own personal comfort. Next, we think about materials. So what do you need for this particular lesson? And what are some CVI considerations for that? You could start with personal equipment. So you're thinking about glasses, hearing aids, orthotics, anything the child needs to be supported and have accessibility. AAC and any assistive tech. When you're thinking about material considerations, anything the child's going to be needing manipulative-wise, what size does it have to be, contrast considerations, what's the impact of glare? Will that impact what materials you're using? Strategic use of color, limiting clutter and crowding, providing an element of light if required, or using reflective surfaces to help draw attention. And then you also think of materials in terms of what you need to present information. So if the child benefits from using backlighting or needs a backlit surface, are they using an iPad? Are they using a light box? Reduced clutter methods. So thinking of an Invisiboard, a blackboard that's going to help you reduce the clutter or access to clutter in the environment. And then visual field accessibility, such as using a slant board. All of this can be listed under what you need for that lesson. Then you also want to think about timing, the when, and this far extends beyond, it's going to be 10 a.m. on a Thursday. This is thinking very detailed about the impact of timing. So is the lesson at the same time every day? Is timing predictable? Is it routine? And if it isn't, does the skill change based on the time of day? Because if you're seeing fluctuations in the student's participation or ability to have higher accuracy levels, if you're taking data, could it be that maybe they're just too tired, or that something in the environment has changed to change that outcome for the student? And you have to think about, is there a warm-up activity? And if so, how is that going to be implemented? Is the lesson following a challenging lesson? And that can be physically, visually, or otherwise. Will you have the child's optimal visual attention if it's a visual task in that moment? And then thinking about some aspects that happened during the lesson. So you want to think ahead of this. When you start the lesson, knowing, is the child calm and alert? Are they agitated, overstimulated, tired, sick? Is it a good time to engage in that lesson? And if visual accessibility isn't an option, what else can we do in that moment to support the student in engaging to the level that they can engage at? We also always want to know if the student has had a recent seizure or received medication, because that can impact alert state, and noting if the child is hungry or thirsty. I mean, I've sat through a ton of meetings myself where I'm thinking about lunch and I can't focus on what we're learning about now. The same goes for our students, the same goes for everybody. And I think this section of timing, excuse me, is really important, because I think back to Matt Tejan talking about that visual battery. We want to maintain that battery life for as long as possible. We don't want to further deplete it, and we want it as full as it can be so that we can maximize accessibility and learning. We need students to be alert in order to learn. If a child is heavily fatigued and we're just struggling to wake them up, it might not be the best time for them to have that lesson. So just be prepared and have alternative means of providing information. The last part of this section is the how. So now you've got exactly when this is going to be, some considerations around what the student needs, materials, and environment. So now it's, how are you going to start to set up this lesson and implement instruction? So how are you setting it up? Where will you as the instructor be seated? What steps need to be taken in order to ask the student what you need to ask them and have them respond in whatever activity that might be? How are you going to have the student's attention? And here I want to pause and say that attention does not mean forcing eye contact. A lot of times that's how we gauge student engagement. If the student's looking at us, we know that they're ready to learn. For students with CVI, this isn't always achievable. So it's not a time to force them to do that. It's a time to say, what do I need to know about this student to know that they're ready for me to begin instruction? And then specifying how you're going to deliver instruction. So thinking of whatever that child needs as far as receptive communication goes, and also considering the visual accessibility of instruction. So if you're using sign language to provide instruction, does the child able to attend to that sign and understand what you're saying? Just thinking about that visual accessibility. Here I've put just a very oversimplified outline of what I mean by setting up the lesson. So place the slant board in front of Erin, sit on Erin's left side, place 2 of the letters on the board horizontally with 7 inches spacing between, and ask Erin to point to letter blank. So that's a very, very simple example, but the whole point of this is to say anybody that picks up your lesson plan knows exactly what you want to do and how you're going to present it. And this helps maintain that consistency. I'm not going to come in and teach the student one way and then have a teaching assistant come in and do it a completely different way, because that can cause confusion and it could inhibit learning. Now, all of this information would go on your lesson plan, but also you'd have to think about how you're going to monitor some of these thoughts on a data sheet, because we can try to control things to the best of our ability, but it's not always possible. Life happens, changes happen. So on the data sheet, I would note the student's alert state. So are they awake and alert, agitated, tired, ill? I'd note any changes in medical status or medication, changes in the environment, or any unpredicted changes in timing. Were you supposed to do that lesson in the morning, but then you did it in the afternoon? And the reason behind monitoring this is if the child's less engaged, if they're not doing as well, there's a reason for it. And if any of these factors are the reason, at least we've noted it, and then we can make a plan for moving forward and how to prevent that in the future. So that's all about making it perceivable. So let's step into the next area now of how are we going to make it meaningful. So I said I was going to come back to this equation. Being perceivable doesn't always make an experience learnable. We can look at this equation, but it doesn't mean we understand it. And this is something that I think is overlooked often. If a child's looking, then they understand. And that's not necessarily the case. So we just need to be really careful to scaffold learning, identify the child's current skills, identify prior knowledge, and link to prior knowledge. So how are we going to use that past understanding to now build on the next level of skill? And there's different ways of building skills and concepts. We can build in brand new skills and concepts. We can strengthen and weaker skills and concepts, or maybe sometimes we need to replace wrong information with correct information. Like for this equation right here, I would need a significant amount of instruction around this. I know some of these symbols and letters and numbers in isolation, but I don't know what it means altogether. So that would be my next step in learning, building off some of those simple things I already know, and then using that to teach me more advanced equation, which I have no interest in learning, by the way. And then thinking about this skill scaffolding. So this feeds right into the development of meaningful IEP goals and objectives. So skill scaffolding needs to be evident in our IEP goals and objectives, because objectives build off prior knowledge and current abilities, and they pave the way for next level knowledge. So we have long-term goals, and then we have all these short-term goals that lead up to it. What are we going to do along the way to get to that long-term goal? And it has to be scaffolded, and it has to be strategic. So here's an example. Say I have a long-term goal that I want a child to meet. And this long-term goal is the student will read words that identify a familiar person, place, thing, action, or event. So that's about a pre-K kindergarten, close to a kindergarten standard. How can I build a path forward if I'm given the following information about a student? Toby cannot recognize letters, words, or sentences. Toby does not use any formal language. Toby won't look at books and doesn't recognize pictures. Toby cries all day and won't sit at a desk. He doesn't like any toys. Toby can't, doesn't, won't, isn't able to. So if someone were to give me the summary about a student, how could I make a path forward to helping the student meet this objective? And the answer is I absolutely cannot. It is just negative and focused on deficits. And if we're overly focused on what the student can't do, we're not going to have a path for moving forward, and we're really not going to help anybody. What we need to do in scaffolding and moving towards long-term goals is identify what can the student do and where can they go next. So I can't always predict that a child will meet this long-term goal, but that doesn't excuse me from not having a plan for moving forward and as close to that goal as I can get, because the overall goal is to shorten the gap, right? We want to move our children closer, and we can't predict what they can and can't do. We have to optimize opportunity, accessibility, and learning and give them the best shot to get there. So let's look at the positive side. If somebody were to talk to me about Toby and give me this information instead of that negative information, let's think about how we can use that to move forward. So Toby can express himself through facial expressions and by crying or laughing. He can tell me what he wants by reaching or pushing away objects. He can hold objects with two hands and is able to look and maintain visual attention to these objects. Now, this is a starting point. This tells me a lot about Toby's communication. He tells me about how he's using his gross motor skills and hand-eye coordination to tell us what he wants or what he doesn't want. He tells me about he can hold objects with two hands. He's able to look and maintain visual attention to these objects. Oh, and one last thing. Toby's favorite item is the feather duster. So this might seem like a very random piece of information, but Toby was an actual student of mine. And this feather duster actually paved the way for Toby's learning and success. So this brings me to one of my favorite stories of all time. So here's a picture of Toby on Halloween holding his feather duster. When Toby first began in our classroom, he was extremely overwhelmed. He was absolutely terrified, and our heart really broke for him. He would come in every day, he would cry, he was overwhelmed by the amount of people, the really colorful, bright, well-lit environment. It was too much for him. And so my first goal was, how am I going to pave the road forward for Toby? How am I going to make a relationship with him? I have to build trust. I have to engage him. I have to get him to a calm and happy place so that he wants to learn. So every day I would pull out activity after activity, toy after toy, trying to see what Toby's interests were. What does he like? What does he want to do? And I was constantly met with rejection about trucks and puzzles and books, everything. So one day I randomly found a feather duster in our sensory bin, and I said, why not? And so I offered it to Toby, and he absolutely loved this feather duster. And I, by no means am exaggerating when I say he loved it. He stopped crying immediately, and he would play with that feather duster every single day. That was his one piece of enjoyment. And that duster really helped us build that relationship. We began to have something to talk about and interact with. We would play with it with one another. And when I said this paved way for his learning, it certainly did, because this feather duster became his symbol in his calendar system for playtime. So every day he would go to his calendar system, he would take out the feather duster, he'd play with it. When playtime was done, he would go and he would put it in the finish bucket. Over time, he got that concept, and we added in more and more objects that were personally relevant to him, and just opened up so many more opportunities for Toby. So while Toby couldn't meet that long-term goal yet, we had a plan for moving forward. He wasn't reading words at this point, but Toby was able to identify objects that represent a familiar person, place, thing, action, or event. And I'm happy to say that over the years, Toby did meet this objective as written, and we had a strategic path forward. We're constantly looking at his learning media, adjusting it, working as a team, and Toby got where he needed to go. So my point with this whole story is that there's always a path forward. The path forward always isn't obvious, and it takes some creativity. And sometimes it takes something as random as a feather duster to move forward. But the point is, we had a starting point. We knew his strengths. We found out what was motivating him, and we moved forward in his learning, and he was successful. And that's what mattered. So now we're going to talk a bit more about the IEP and lesson plans. going through importance of accommodations, which we touched on, current performance, baseline data, prompting, and data collection and monitoring. And again, this will all be provided for you in some supplementary documents after the fact. So some considerations for goal areas of the IEP. So first and foremost, we already talked about this, accommodations are listed in the IEP. So we know exactly what that child needs. And then under each goal area, we have a current performance that says what the child can currently do. And this current performance needs to reflect the presence of CVI accommodations and baseline data. From there, the current performance, what the child can currently do with these areas of consideration, the goals and objectives are then built around attainable achievements. So you might hear of SMART IEP goals and objectives. IEP goals must be specific, measurable, attainable, results-oriented, and time-bound. So always remember SMART IEP objectives. Quick terminology review. I know we've already talked about accommodations, but I just introduced baseline data, so I just want to touch on that briefly. So baseline data is the starting point for measurement. So that's going into current performance. It's collected prior to teaching and intervention. Some examples of ways that you might see this reflected could be percent accuracy, frequency, duration, rate, and intervals. And the baseline data is what justifies the measurable goal, because you're saying this is what the student can do now, and this is going to be the baseline for comparison as the student moves through their academic school year. So I want to address here a big issue, and that's surrounding missing CVI accommodations in the current performance and baseline skill analysis. So if appropriate accommodations and conditions are not included in the skill assessment, then the data may not reflect the child's current skill level. And I've heard this from parents time and time again as being an issue in the field. So for example, if you assess Sally and determine that at present, Sally has an accuracy of 0% when identifying letters A through J of the alphabet. Well, that shows that Sally really is just starting the skill, that she doesn't really have a strong understanding of letters A through J at all. But then you come to find that that was tested using a field of 10 black and white bubbled letters that are not visually accessible for Sally. So what if you had tested Sally using the accommodations and conditions that she required? Well, maybe you would get, at present, Sally has an accuracy of 75% in identifying capital letters A through J when presented one at a time in enlarged red Arial font presented against the black background. So this current performance shows exactly what Sally needed to have this task be perceivable for her, to be visually accessible for her. So my point here is if we're not doing our testing with the appropriate accommodations, then we're not getting an accurate baseline skill for the student. The student could have 100% accuracy for all we know, but we haven't given them the right accommodations and path for them to demonstrate that skill. And that can have a really detrimental impact on the IEP process, on learning, because we're now just completely missing the child's current level of ability. So there's importance of including the accommodations. So what happens now if you're missing baseline data? So you have this current performance. Sally is working on identifying capital letters. This year, Sally will be increasing her ability to identify capital letters A through J when presented one at a time on a black background with enlarged red font. So this is great because it has detailed accommodations of what Sally needs. And so the goal is for her to increase her ability to identify capital letters. So from that current performance, you come up with an objective. When presented one at a time in an enlarged red font on a black background, Sally will identify capital letters A through J with 80% accuracy across 5 opportunities. So now we know what we're going to measure for the rest of the year. So what happens when we get Sally's progress report? Sally can identify letters A through J with 75% accuracy across 5 opportunities. Well, that's pretty close to 80%. Did Sally make progress? And the answer is, we have no idea, because we never said in the current performance what she could do. So Sally could have already had 80% accuracy. Sally could have already had 75% accuracy. Sally could have had 90% accuracy, and now she's regressed. We don't know because we don't have a baseline for comparison. So it's really important that that's included alongside the accommodations, because otherwise we won't be able to tell if what we're doing is effective. Next up is prompting and fading support. So this is thinking about how much support a child might need initially or at any point in order to achieve a skill. So a prompt is assistance from the teacher that increases likelihood that the student will make a correct response. And there's many different types. Some examples could be physical. So that could be hand under hand, for example, tactile, providing touch cues, modeling, gestural, verbal, visual, written, textual, or auditory. And there's many different ways to deliver a prompt. So you think about accommodations. So what the child needs to be perceivable. You think about baseline data, what they can currently do, and what level of assistance they might need at this point to complete whatever you're asking them to do. So some thoughts that I have around prompting in CVI really surrounds more the visual prompts in that, can your prompt be perceived? So if you're providing a visual prompt, if you're holding up an object or a picture, can the child look at it and understand it? Can the child follow the movement of gestures? So if you're using a point to prompt a student, can they follow your point? Does it depend if you're pointing really fast or if you do a really slow point? Can they follow the direction of movement if they have challenges with motion perception? Can the child see and understand your visual modeling? And are visual prompts considering visual field? And if there's any issues with any of these, you have to rethink your prompt and rethink your approach so that it is accessible for that student to help them move forward. So a little bit more about prompting. So prompting has actually been found to be really helpful, especially in that early acquisition phase of learning, when the child is just learning something for the very, very first time. And reducing errors in early acquisition has found to support discrimination. And I actually found that outlined in CVI literature, as well as the systematic instruction literature. And I think especially for individuals with CVI, that where this could potentially be beneficial is that when you don't have prompts, it can result in endless guessing, which has the potential to increase frustration, which has the potential to increase visual fatigue, and then reduce access. There's plenty of students out there who can guess endlessly and be completely fine, but I think this is something we should always be mindful of when working with any particular child or student. And then in thinking about that early acquisition phase, the benefit of providing an early prompt can help that student have clear expectations. You know, what do you want me to do? Supporting the student in being successful right off the bat, giving that sense of self-accomplishment, higher self-esteem, and giving the reason to participate. We always want to do what we're good at. So if we can help the child to be really good at what they're doing early on and then support them towards independence, I think that really is really helpful. Think again back to that positive and happy experiences, building that memory and engagement over stress and negative experiences. And prompting also can lead to reinforcement. After you've done something well or done something correct, you get some sort of reinforcement, hopefully by an adult or a peer, somebody that's going to reinforce what you've done. So I'm just going to give a quick example of the presence of no prompt and of a prompt. And again, prompting can look very different for many different kids. So I've just made up this random example. So say we know two things about Sally. Say we know that Sally is just starting for the very first time to learn how to recognize letters A, B, and C. And say that we know that Sally loves animals. So here's example A of no prompt. Putting up 3 letters for the first time, Sally's never seen them, and saying, Sally, find letter A. So Sally guesses and points to C. And the teacher says, no, that's not letter A, that's C, try again. So Sally tries again. She goes to B. No, the teacher says, that's wrong. I want you to find A, that is B, try again. And Sally goes to A. Great, now find C. So this can be problematic for a few different reasons. For one, it's just endless guessing, and that can increase the frustration, as I said, reduce visual fatigue. We know that visual battery runs out quickly. we want to optimize the time that the student has on task. Second, there's a lot of language and not clear expectation. So I asked Sally to find letter C, A, but when she points to C, I'm giving this really long-winded amount of feedback. No, that's not letter A, that's C, try again. And I think we have to be really careful in how much language and feedback we're giving certain students, especially with this prevalence of auditory processing disorder coming alongside CVI. If you're giving too much language, how are you communicating to the student exactly what they need to do in a very clear manner? The last issue I have with this example is the fact that there's absolutely no reinforcement. Sally works endlessly to get to A, and then you're just on to asking her to find the next thing. You give her a little bit of verbal praise, but there's no ultimate reward. I mean, that's not fun for anybody to just be drilled endlessly and then just be pushed through an activity. So here's example B. So this is with a prompt, and this would be errorless. So Sally's learning this for the very first time, so I want to show her how to be successful. So I would start by first previewing a letter, putting the one up that I want her to find. Here is letter A. And then putting up the field of 3 and saying, Sally, find letter A. My prompt would be immediate and point to letter A, to which Sally would then point to letter A. This gives me the opportunity to give really high level of enthusiasm. Great job, Sally, you found A, woohoo! And then it also gives me an opportunity to tie in some higher level reinforcement. So I said that Sally likes animals. So maybe when she points to the letter A, the very hungry alligator comes rum, 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 rum in and eats letter A, and we have a fun period of engagement with one another. Or there's a bear that comes in to eat letter B when we get there, or a hungry cat, etc. Build off the student interests. So with this, yes, I'm giving Sally the right answer right away, but I'm showing her exactly what I want her to do, and I'm giving her the opportunity to be successful, and I'm giving her reinforcement for engaging with this. And so she can learn that not only is she accomplishing a task, she's also going to have fun. There's something to look forward to here. And so when I talk about that immediate point, so this for Sally would be her controlling point prompt. A controlling prompt is the least invasive prompt that guarantees a correct response. So when we're providing prompting and assistance to students, you always want it to be least restrictive, least invasive. So if I were to determine that Sally's controlling prompt was a point, then I've already gotten to know Sally. I know that she doesn't require a physical prompt. I don't need to physically engage with her whatsoever. I know that if I point to something, Sally knows what that means, and she's going to point to something. So that helps me guarantee that Sally's going to have an accurate response. And then another important point here is that prompts are not meant to be permanent, and there should always be a plan for fading them out. So for Sally, when I'm first starting with her, maybe I need to point right away to A. I need to point right away to B, point right away to C. And after we've done this lesson a few times, maybe that's when I start to have a plan for fading it out. So I ask Sally to find A, but this time instead of pointing immediately, maybe I wait 3 seconds and give her the opportunity. And then the next time I wait 5 seconds, and eventually I won't need to engage whatsoever because she will have hopefully moved towards that skill. So it's giving the opportunity for independence and also just being clear if she is incorrect, how am I going to respond and help her to be correct and change my own teaching in order to meet her needs. And I think, as we go through this, when we talked earlier about how we all learn and thinking about memory, experience, recognition, it's easy to think about these strategies as school-based requirements for students, but we really all need initial prompts to learn initial skills, and it all looks different for all of us. So for example, if I were doing a woodworking task, which again would never happen for me, and I needed your help, and I said, find the high torque screw, we could have you find the high torque screw by picking out screw by screw by screw to show me, and I could say, no, keep looking, keep looking. Or I could just show you it right away and say, hey, this is the high torque screw, this is the one I need. That's going to really set the foundation for your own learning. And then over time, you might need me to point out that screw a few more times for you, but eventually you would learn it yourself and I wouldn't have to show you. So we all learn this way, it just looks differently. So in summary for meaningful lessons, as a whole, we need systems to ensure that access to educational materials and instruction are matched to and do not exceed a child's skills and abilities. So we have to make sure that it's absolutely perceivable through accommodations and methodologies, built off that prior knowledge and learning that's measured with the accommodations, because if we don't have the accommodations, we don't really know exactly what they know at the moment. We have to have a foundation for measurement, so the baseline data. We have to have a strategic plan for prompting, so what does the child need now and how am I going to fade that out over time? And then we have to support all of this and the progress moving forward through quantitative and qualitative data. So what is qualitative and quantitative data? Qualitative data is observable and reported. It can be collected through observation or interview, and it's non-numerical. So here's an example of what you might see as a qualitative report. Sally is increasing her ability to identify capital letters. She really enjoys the activity and is motivated by the animal puppets. The red font has supported her visual attention and recognition. And by the end of the lesson, Sally requires a visual break. So it gives me a nice summary, a detailed summary of what Sally needs and how she's doing. Quantitative data is numerical. So this would be a numerical report. When presented one at a time in enlarged red font on black background, Sally can identify capital letters A through J with 75% accuracy across 5 opportunities. So I find qualitative and quantitative data to both be incredibly valuable. I want to know everything there is to know about a student to measure how they're doing or to think more effectively about what I need to do to intervene. With that being said, IEP goals and objectives are measurable. So if you're going to report on a student's progress, that also has to be numerical. You have to have a way of measuring that quantitatively so that you're reporting accurately. And data is really helpful because it supports objectivity. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with students where we'll be really engaged in activity and say I'm asking a student to find something from a field of 2. We're having a really good time. And all along the way, I'm saying, oh, you know, they're doing really well. This is like, they're really hitting their number here at the high accuracy level because it's positive, it's engaging, it's fun, the student's having a good time. But then I'll go back and look at my data sheet and say 50%, 50%, 50%. So in thinking about that, then I know if I'm asking the student to choose from a field of 2, it's just a matter of probability at that point. They're just happening to get it right half the amount of time. So while I might be biased in the actual lesson of thinking that I'm having an 80% accuracy level, the data is going to help me really look at this and say, okay, I'm at 50%. That needs to change because this has been happening for a while. What do I need to do to change it? And data also, it just in general monitors the effectiveness of materials and methods used during instruction. So is the child progressing, regressing, plateauing? And if any of these changes are occurring, I have to reevaluate, is it perceivable? Is it meaningful? Do I need to change my prompting method? Is that not effective? And you always need to have an easy to use data sheet in order specific to that targeted skill, because all different skills are being looked at in a different way. Lastly, data monitors specific trends in accuracy and error. And error trends are just as important as correct responses. So here's what I mean by that. If I have a student, Beth looks at her name symbol when signing into the attendance board in the morning in 5 out of 5 opportunities weekly. When presented with her name symbol during morning meeting, she will look in 1 out of 5 opportunities weekly. So that's a big difference there. Beth is doing really well and she's signing in, looking at her name symbol in the morning, but then having trouble in morning meeting. So what does that tell me? That tells me that I should probably look into the environment. What's happening in morning meeting that's preventing Beth from having that visual attention? Is it too much clutter? Is there too much noise? Is there too much chaos? And what steps do I need to take in order to help Beth be successful in that moment? Another example could be Joe can identify his name with 100% accuracy when paired with names such as Christina, but his accuracy is 30% when paired with names like Jane and Mia. So what does this tell me? This tells me that maybe I should start to look into the importance of gross size versus details with Joe. Maybe he can only identify his name because it looks shorter than the bigger, longer name, Christina. So that makes me want to think more about what's perceivable to Joe and refine the way I'm going to teach. So home stretch here. So we've talked about making it perceivable. We talked about making it meaningful. And now we're going to talk about making it motivating. So we are all motivated to engage with learning. That gives us positive self-worth. Success is motivating. We want to do what we're good at. When we're motivated, we're really engaged. And motivation is driven by reward or consequence. There's nothing that we do in our day-to-day life that doesn't have a reason. We do absolutely everything for a reason. And without having motivation, learning can be more difficult. I said earlier, I'm horrible at math. I can't stand math. The only time I've ever been interested in math was during Matt Tejan's CVI Now presentation, and that's about it. I'm not good at math, and so I never want to engage with it. And I can actually physically feel, if you start talking to me about math, I feel this mental block going right up, and I'm not in any way motivated to learn more about that. And I think this happens a lot with our students who, you're not being successful. Well, I'm not going to engage with you because that's not fun. There's no reinforcement for me whatsoever in this task. And I think most people could relate to that in one way or another. And thinking about math, my least favorite subject, I want to share another story about being stuck in accounting rut. And again, this is actually that student, Toby, who I talked about earlier with the feather duster. So with Toby, I had designed a math lesson, and he was going to be asked to count up to 3 manipulatives at a time. So I'd put one block down, he'd count to 1, count to 2, count to 3, etc. So for setting up this lesson, I chose to use counting blocks, just these basic blocks. And I would line them up in a linear fashion. And I'd ask Toby to say, to count. I'd say, how many? And if Toby got it right, I'd say, great job. And if Toby got it wrong, I'd say, try again. And I'd have him try again. And I would have about 10 trials per session. And I think Toby was about 4 or 5 at this point. So what happened with this lesson? It was an absolute disaster. Every single time we sat down for math, Toby would begin to constantly slouch. He'd roll off the chair. He'd look around the room and try to redirect conversation. Toby wasn't making progress, and neither of us were having fun. So why? My lesson was really boring. It was perceivable to Toby, but it wasn't motivating. He could see everything. He understood the meaning behind it, but he didn't care. My choice of reinforcement was not motivating. So I used verbal praise, but it wasn't worth the effort of the task for him. Me saying good job, it didn't hold enough weight. And my response to his incorrect answers did not provide enough clarity or errorless learning. And this resulted in just more student frustration and withdrawal. And the length of my lesson was too long. So it was ultimately my responsibility to reevaluate, make changes, and pave the road for Toby's success. And I'm happy to say we were successful. So I just scrapped my whole lesson and I said, what does Toby like? Toby loves trucks. Toby loves cars. He loves the book Trashytown. So I built a trash truck. And instead of blocks, I used little Dixie cups that I made into trash cans. And so Toby, instead of counting blocks, was asked to count trash cans. So he'd pick up one trash can, put in the trash truck and go 1. He'd pick up the second one, say 2. Then I'd say, how many? He'd say 2 trash trucks. And then I would drive the Trashytown truck all around the table. And I'd do a quote from the book. And then we'd dump all the garbage out on the table. And it was really fun. He was really engaged. He would laugh. I had so much more success with this lesson because I looked at what Toby found meaningful, what Toby found motivating, and I incorporated that into the lesson. Additionally, when you have 10 trials, that can seem like it's going on forever, especially if you hate the subject matter. So instead of doing 10, I said, I'll just cut it down to 5. And for every time that Toby had a correct response, so if he counted 1 trash can, he also got to put a star on his little miniature star chart. And after 5 stars, he got to pick a little bit of a movie that he could watch. So I think this really helped Toby because it helped him be motivated through the content we were learning, motivated through the star chart, and motivated because this lesson wasn't going to go on forever. There was going to be the end after the 5 stars. And so I think the theme here is that, as a teacher, we have to constantly self-evaluate. We have to observe what the students are doing and make changes. It's not always easy to see the forest from the trees. So you have to step out and think critically. Don't take things personally, make changes, and you'll see more student success. So in conclusion, the learning process is absolutely individualized. So just because a student has CVI doesn't mean they're going to learn in the same way, doesn't mean they're going to need the same accommodations, it doesn't mean they're going to take the same path forward. I need to know absolutely everything there is about that child, including their personal interests, their previous learning, their communication, et cetera. The list goes on and on and on. The learning process is dynamic and the learning process is comprehensive. It's not linear, it's always changing and evolving. Lessons are not meant to be created and remain static. They're meant to change with the needs of the student. And that's based on the reflection of what your data is telling you, what the student's behavior is telling you. How are you going to make changes to be effective? This is a screenshot of a flowchart that'll be available that I created based on all the steps we've talked about through this presentation. That'll be available on CVI now, but just shows an overview of the process you would take. And I just want to end with this. I've talked a lot about goals and objectives today, but as we know, goals and objectives are just a drop in the bucket of a student's life. All their other experiences that are happening around them is what's contributing to learning, building those experiences. So always think about what's perceivable, meaningful, and motivating across day-to-day activities, because they're just as important as IEP goals and objectives, if not more so. So that's it.
Yay, thank you, Marguerite. Oh my gosh, that was so much. That was so wonderful. I really appreciate it. There have been a lot of questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
If you want to stop sharing your screen.
Sure.
And we'll just get all situated here.
Great.
Good, there we are. So I'm going to try to compile them into areas. There's been a lot of questions about data. One of the first questions that came up is with so many ways to know, if a child is looking, how do you organize all that data, especially if the child's nonverbal?
So in all the ways the child's looking, if the child's nonverbal, I think it depends on what you're looking for. So I think you have to know exactly what you're measuring, why you're measuring it. So it seems like a really broad response, but when you're measuring what the child's looking at, are you looking for visual attention, or are you trying to gauge recognition? So I think, one of the issues that can be a little bit difficult is that we get these recommendations for how to make something perceivable for the child. So we can make color, movement, clutter, light, for example. But if we implement them all at the same time, it's hard to weed out to know exactly what's making the child look, right? So I think it's about being methodical in your presentation of what materials you're showing the child. If you, for example, just start with color, I'll start with a color preference, for example, and you're doing a story box and you've got 6 different stuffed animals and you're taking data every day on the child's visual attention to those objects that are, let's say, single colored. Do you notice a trend that the child's attending to certain colors over other colors? Do you notice a difference based on the field? So if you're going to present 2 objects, are they attending in one field over another? So I really think it's critical to break it down to see exactly what you want to measure in that moment, if that makes sense. And then as far as recognition, I think it's really building off of they're looking, and are they looking more consistently at something over something maybe less familiar, less engaging? And what else are they doing to help you with that recognition, especially if it's out of context or in context? I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, as a follow-up, you mentioned reliable responses. And so what if this child has multiple reliable responses to show that they're looking or recognition? How would you organize that? Would you kind of create like a data sheet that just includes all of their responses, just a way to organize that data?
So if you already know the reliable responses of the student, then you want to make sure everyone on the team is aware of those reliable responses, because I think that's first and foremost. If that's already been established, then you already know that those behaviors are evident, but not everyone will notice that in the same way.
Yeah.
For example, there was a student whose reliable response was sighing.
Mhm.
All he would do was sigh. So me coming in for the first time, not knowing that student, I would have no idea that was a reliable response because I don't know the student.
Right.
So I think it's about communication and documentation of what that is. And if you're finding that there's a particular area of reliable response that you really want to capitalize on, making that a goal area and being really, communicate with the team that this is an area that you need to look at. And so that everyone's giving your feedback and monitoring that across different environments.
Nice. Thank you.
Sure.
So there was a question submitted beforehand. How do you compile the data from assessments into a functional reference tool teachers can use when lesson planning?
So like a CVI evaluation. So I've done it in a few different ways. So typically I make, well, first off, anything I put in a reference sheet essentially comes from the recommendations of the report. And the recommendations of the report are coming directly from whatever was evaluated. So usually I will just pull those recommendations over into a shortened list. My preference is to try to align them based on how you would support a lesson plan. So based on the outcome of the vision assessment, these are some considerations for materials. Here are some considerations for the environment. Here are some considerations for especially response time, how long you have to wait, that latency factor. So usually I make cheat sheets based on the recommendations, and then also with the fact that a lot of the recommendations that come out of CVI evaluations then need to be further refined to meet the needs of that student in any particular setting.
Mhm.
So, for example, you might know that color is important, but what does that mean for the speech session or AAC device? You have to be creative kind of moving forward. So I think it's about getting those basics down and then working with the team members to further use that strategically.
Nice. Thank you. Um, okay. So continuing on the data topic, I feel that my son's teachers don't have the time to track data the way that you described in the presentation, nor do I, even though I agree it would be so important. Do you have suggestions for clever solutions?
Time is always a factor. I've never heard a teacher that say they have enough time ever, or a parent for that matter. So I definitely hear you on that.
Yeah.
I think it's about setting limits as to what is achievable. What can you do? I've had teachers say, I'm monitoring, 10 objectives in this hour. How am I going to do it? And so I've said, well, pick one, pick
Mhm.
what's doable, pick what you can do in that moment.
Mhm.
Um, Sometimes this is going to sound very technical, but sometimes if you're tracking a skill that doesn't just occur when you're seated at a desk, which I think is where you're most successful taking data because you can just quickly write something down. Um, if you're tracking a skill across environments and you want to know how frequently the child's completing that skill, having a clicker. So there you're just clicking a button and then later on you can go back and fill out your data, or
Mhm.
taking a mental note, carrying around. We've had teachers carrying around notepads in their back pocket to make notes as to how they're going to complete that later.
Mhm.
So those are some creative ways, but yeah, I think it's just focusing in on exactly what you need to measure and why, and making a plan for how you can do it in a reasonable way.
You've created pre-made data sheets to work with your kids, correct?
Yes.
And so you just have those like at the ready, right?
Oh yes, yeah, yep. So when I was, so I'm not actually, yeah. So I'm not actively teaching right now. But what I actually did for my students when I was teaching was each student had a binder,
Mhm.
and where I would outline exactly what their IEP objective was, and
Mhm.
I would have my data sheets printed and ready to go at any point in time.
Mhm.
There's a pen, everything you needed to write it down was there. So that's how I organized myself. And I also use that as a learning tool for my new staff coming in, where if I had a brand new teaching assistant start, I'd say, here's the student's binder, read through their IEP objectives, read the lesson plans, let me know questions, and I would go through it that way. So everything was already pre-printed and ready to go before the school day started. Yeah.
So it sounded like with some front loading, it could make it much more time efficient as the day goes on. Because I know as a
Abs-
former special educator too, it's like you have no time. Yes.
Absolutely. Front loading is key. Having everything you need ready for that lesson.
Okay.
Because not only with the data, if you finally have a student, I don't know, it depends on where the student is or what the lesson structure is like, but if you have a student for a half hour and you haven't prepped and you don't have the data sheet ready, you're carving into at least 10 minutes, maybe
Yeah.
5 to 10 minutes of all that prep time. So having everything ready, organized, and ready to go absolutely helps with data collection as well as implementation.
And I think are you gonna share example of one of your data sheets? That we
Yes, so on the website, I'll have example data sheets for, I did a few different formats as far as like desk work,
Yeah.
a task analysis, and then I added in the considerations for CVI. So by no means is this the rule. It would have to be adapted for every individual
Right.
objective, but there will be some examples available.
I love that. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, I want to go to somebody who asked about baseline data. Here we go. So I just want to be sure I understand this correctly. I love when questions start like this because I say the same thing. Every goal on the IEP should have baseline data, correct? For example, we have a communication goal with baseline data. However, no other goals do.
Yes. I mean, as far as I'm aware, goals are to be measurable because otherwise, how are you going to monitor progress? So if there's a area where there is not a measurable goal, I would ask about it.
Mhm.
I would ask about, why was this goal written the way it was, and how are we planning on moving forward to maintain that measurement of skill?
And if there's no baseline data, as a parent, if we're reading the IEP and realizing like, where did this goal come from? What's the baseline data? And there's no baseline data presented, like, what are the next steps there?
So I think it's all about discussion. I think knowing why the student's going down the path that they are. Every parent has the right to ask. Every teacher has the right to ask. Figuring out, why we are where we are. So I think it's about asking about kind of what I talked about here. What was the prior knowledge? What were the prereqs to this skill? Why was this skill chosen? And where is my child currently so that I can know that the child has moved forward.
Yeah.
So I think it's all about discussion and open communication.
Yeah. And I love that the present levels include the conditions in which the child can show you that skill. That's so important. It's something that I feel like is not as front and center as it should be when talking about IEP development. So thanks.
Absolutely.
How do you communicate learning methods working at school to the parents so they can be enforced at home?
Oh, great question. So when I was teaching, as I said, I'm not currently teaching right now, but I mean, I think one of the biggest steps forward there is having that baseline of communication with families. So we were always very sure, especially I think this is a strength at Perkins of establishing strong communication. So I think it's not only identifying my goals as a teacher, which hopefully tie into the goals of the parents, because the IEP is supposed to be developed in tandem with the parents' concerns and parents' dreams and wishes for their child, right? So what I've done is had a lot of conversations about, this is how this child's doing, having periodic conversations with the parents. What do you need at home? What can I support you with at home? What task is important to you at home? Because I might be sitting at a desk doing accounting activity, but maybe you're focused on helping the child brush their teeth, right? So I think it's about that communication and thinking about how do we take the assessment information that we have and make it achievable or accessible in all these different circumstances and environments.
Yeah. I mean, that flexibility of adapting the skill in multiple situations is huge. And that's when our kids really have it because we know how much different items, different environments affect our kids.
Mhm.
And, especially a lot of kids need that separation from school to home, right? So you just can't bring the school activities into home or else it's going to be a total blow up. At least that's what Henry does for me.
100%. And I think that's what every child does.
Yeah.
Honestly, I mean, I've had so many teachers or parents say to me, well, they won't do this for me at home. I'm like, well, I go home and I kick off my shoes and I lay on the couch. So I get why our students
Right.
want to do that too. Our children want to do that too. And there's a different set of rules at home. Home is comfortable. Home is flexible. Home is fun. School has a very different
Yeah.
tune to it.
Yeah. Okay. Other questions. Let's see. Question about when you're talking about lesson plan design.
Mhm.
A parent asked, can you give an example of a warm-up activity?
Sure. That can range from student to student
Mhm.
for sure. Some activities might include tactile warm-up activities. So maybe you're playing with Play-Doh. Maybe you're starting with something that's really student interest-based. I've
Mhm.
had students who actually get a hand massage before, which sounds lovely. before their lesson. And it really, I come from primarily the world of deafblind education.
Right.
And we focus very strongly on having a clear beginning, middle, end, and recognizing what the student needs in that beginning phase in order to transition to the activity. So it could be any activity you want. Maybe it's listening to music. But it's really, is it goal oriented? I know that some students use tactile engagement to warm up their visual system. Others, it's just acclimating to maybe a less fun activity that you're going to do. Setting the stage, getting something really exciting, and then working on the task, and then ending with something really exciting. So it really centers around student interest and a lot of the time sensory input, at least in my experience.
Yeah. How do you know what the best warm-up is? I mean, of course, you can talk about observation assessment. I mean, for me, from my personal example with Henry, his TVI realized that he needs that hand warm-up to activate his visual system. When he has that hand warm-up, then he's actually able to read print words, and I never would have realized that. And it's like, how can our kids' school team learn about these really needed processes for them to be able to use their vision at their best?
Oh, great question. Yes, obviously I go back to assessment, but it's not only formal assessment. It's like every time you're interacting with a child, it's assessment. And I really think it comes with relationship building, finding out what the student really likes and enjoys, preference assessment, and really incorporating their interests in what you're doing. Sometimes it takes trial and error. Like I had said, it's different from a warm-up activity. With the feather duster example, I pulled out every single thing I could think of until I got to where I need to go. So sometimes it's trial and error. And then as you get to know the student, I feel you build that relationship and it becomes intuitive. So I think you just have to be really analytical in observing the student, understanding what they like, have conversations with the parent. What do they like to do at home in their free time? That tells you a lot. If you just let a child loose in a playroom and see what they do, that's where you get the most rich information. And then start to think a little more creatively from there.
Love that. Okay, looking at more questions. Sure. Here is one about how to tie in a student's IEP goals meaningfully throughout the whole day. That's a big one. This is a big question. So not having individual providers work on goals separately from each other, but instead integrating topics, concepts, ideas through reading, math, typing, speech therapy, O&M, TVI sessions, OT, and so on. For example, how to have students work on reading, speech, and typing goals with concepts and words that have been pre-taught with salient features and comparative thought in order to strengthen the understanding of material.
Wow, that's a lot of food for thought, but all really, really good food for thought. I think, my first response is communication and collaboration. The strongest teams I've worked with are those that talk to one another. We're in the transdisciplinary team, primarily at Perkins. So we've got speech, OTs, we have audiologists, TVIs, et cetera. Everyone's working together. So I think having that communication before the IEP is really important. I've seen a lot of success with that pre-planning where we all recognize exactly what the child needs for accessibility, and we're all understanding what skills the child is working on with any one discipline area, and then capitalizing on that. So building off one another. I know within recent years, they've focused a lot on shared goals and objectives. So for example, speech, you're working on communication goals all day long. It's not just happening in speech, but maybe the SLP is the one measuring it. But thinking of ways to have conversation between the teacher and the speech language pathologist as to how can I facilitate this now throughout the day? How can I use what you're working on discreetly across all settings and give you information as to how that's happening in naturally occurring environments? We've also had team members, again, back to communication, discuss how some of these skills can just be embedded naturally throughout the day. So instead of just focusing on these skills being taught at specific periods of time in specific environments, maybe the students working on counting in the classroom, and then they are going to go with their O&M, travel across campus, work on their landmarks and their routes, and going all the way to the cafe across campus, switching over to the speech language pathologist, who's going to then help them use money to pay for a snack at the snack bar. So it's about that transfer. You're working on these math skills in this classroom setting, but then you're transferring this now across different providers in different settings. And then I feel like that's a really natural way to integrate these
Yeah.
skills
Mhm.
in a functional way.
Yeah, it's a big question. It's making my mind run too.
Yeah, it's a big one.
I'm really grateful that Henry's team, they're really strong at collaboration. I see that, even different specialists join together, like the OT and TVI have a joint session. Um, the TVI works with the reading specialist in a joint session as well. And it's really powerful because, our kids need so much support. And expertise and to ensure their access to learning. And then that means that everybody's sharing the goals as well. It's just important that multiple disciplines share goals. I think that's a really great point. So I'm just rambling right now. I just want to make sure there are
Mhm.
any other questions. Doesn't look like it. They love some parents said they love the description of using the trash truck with the trash cans. I know I need to take that for Henry. It's such a good one. Um, and yeah, I think we're good here. So
Great.
thank you so much, Marguerite. Really, really appreciate your expertise as always. So much to process and think about it, but it's really important because our kids deserve the best learning opportunities they have, right? High expectations. We have no idea what our kids are capable of. And even though no, not even though. I mean, our kids are neurodiverse, but they're still brilliant and have a lot of gifts, and we just need to unlock that. So what you've presented is a pathway to this, and I think it's really wonderful. So thank you so much. Thank you to all the families who joined us today. Recording will be in the CVI Now Facebook group for a little while, and then it will be posted onto the CVI Now website, hopefully early next week, with all of the materials that you said we're gonna link to all those materials that you presented as well. So thank you so much for, again, your expertise and your time, and everyone be well and have a wonderful day. Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for watching this event brought to you by CVI Now here at Perkins School for the Blind. Go to cvinow.org to learn more.